Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and it is March. And while it's not time to plant yet, it is time to prep my beds. So if you have been wondering how I do ongoing maintenance in my field so that I don't have to buy in as much soil, you're going to want to watch today's video. Let's go. Spring can be very, very crazy here at the farm. So April in particular is going to be a little bit nuts for me. And then it's just planting time. So usually I like to get things prepped a little bit in advance of planting time so that when it is time to plant, I can hit the ground. What I do here in the field is I practice what I call composting in place. So composting in place is just kind of skipping the process of putting things into a compost pile and then moving that compost back to the field. I've mentioned before in previous videos, I'll link it below, that I do a lot of deep mulch. I do that instead of using plastic landscape fabric. So the deep mulch lets me do a few things. Number one, it helps retain moisture in our field. Number two, it helps keep the soil temperatures nice and even, which is good for the microbial life, which is good for things like lowering the amount of inputs and fertilizers that I have to use. And it also helps keep the weeds down. So lots of benefits from using deep mulch, but there is some work that comes along with that. Using deep mulch, and we use usually a wood chip actually in the pathway. And using wood chips, I don't use them in my annual rows. I'm also going to link my mulch video below so that you can know what kind of mulches I use and when. But specifically for walkways, I typically use wood chip mulch. That's because it has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, which means it's going to take longer to break down. So you probably already know this. If you use straw in your garden bed versus wood chips, straw breaks down much faster. It has a lower C to N ratio. So wood chips take longer to break down. Some of these have been down for a couple of years now. It is getting thin, and every once in a while I'll come in and refresh this layer of wood chips. But in the field in particular, what happens is you can see we kind of get a little settling of the beds. So I do like to have a mounded bed just because we have clay soil here. It helps a little bit with drainage. If we do get big rainfalls, it helps to not totally drown out our plants. So composting in place, what I mean by that is I have those wood chips in the walkway. And you may know this, but when you do a nice thick layer of wood chips and then you move it aside, underneath is this beautiful layer of humus, this rich kind of loamy soil, and the soil life has broken it down. It's become this very nice texture. So that is underneath my walkway layers here. But how do I get that onto the bed? So I've composted in place a little bit. I've got some nice organic matter, some loamy soil here in the walkways that I don't want to waste in the walkways. I'm going to move it up and onto the beds. You can see that we actually did have a cover crop on this bed last year, so there is already some nice texture in this soil. Let's just take a look and see what it looks like. We do still have some roots here existing in the soil, so some nice organic matter too. That's always a good thing. So that's kind of what this soil looks like here in the beds. Again, that cover crop, this is all thank you to cover cropping here and organic matter and all these practices that we do. So the process is not very complicated. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get a nice big tarp. And then I've also got my hard tine rake. This is very helpful for scooping the mulch up. I have a big old broom. This is nice for just leveling out the beds. And then I also have a shovel because I'm going to shovel that soil from the walkway and up and onto the bed. So I'm going to lay the tarp over the bed next to the walkway. Then I am going to move the wood chip mulch from the walkway, and I'm going to put it up and on top of the bed that I've covered with a tarp. I'm doing that because it's saving me some work and it's helping keep that mulch from getting mixed into the beds. I don't want wood chip mulch getting mixed into my annual beds. There's just too much turnover that happens in those beds, and I don't want those wood chips to get mixed down and into that soil because that can cause a little bit of a nitrogen tie-up. It doesn't happen if the mulch is sitting on top of the soil, but it can if it gets mixed into the soil itself. So I want to keep it out of the soil. That's why I'm using that tarp. I'm putting the mulch up and on top of the tarp, and then I'm going to shovel the dirt from the walkway up and onto the bed, and then I'm going to move the mulch back into the walkway. So it's a little bit of a process. Now, given I am a one-woman show, so I usually break this into a couple days' work. I'm estimating it's probably going to take me about 30 minutes to do one row, but it is physical work, so I can probably only do maybe 4 rows in a day, which means I should be able to do my whole field of annuals in 2 or 3 days. So not too bad, and in the grand scheme of farming, kind of a drop in the bucket, but it's also much cheaper. All right, so you can see behind me, I've gotten 2 rows done. It's taking me about an hour, so not too bad considering that this is 80 feet of garden bed. So the leveling out step, I do like to do that step this time of year. It's not necessary, you don't necessarily have to do it, but it's easiest when the soil is kind of light and fluffy right after shoveling, versus if it snows again, it's gonna get kind of weighed down a little bit harder to sweep. So as I was doing this, I thought of a couple questions that you guys might have about it. So hit me below if I don't answer something that you have a question on. One is, how often do I do this? That will kind of depend on your climate. So for me, I live in a fairly dry climate. We're Colorado zone 5-6, pretty heavy clay soil. And for me, a mulch layer, it's about this deep right now in my walkways, will last me probably 2 years, 3 years maybe, if it's very dry. But if you're in a wetter climate, it might not last that long. So you might need to do this more often, where you're getting the organic matter from down below the mulch layer, moving it on top of the beds, and then refreshing your mulch layer. So honestly, it seems like a ton of work, but when I think about how much I'm saving in buying compost, in the lack of quality often in purchased compost, the questionable ingredients in compost. So you guys might not know this, but composts don't have to be labeled. So they don't have to tell you what is in compost. It's not a requirement. If you seek out an OMRI certified compost, then that means it can't contain certain things like biosolids, but it is very, very difficult to maintain those standards. So those composts are typically expensive. So that's why I prefer to just compost in place. I know exactly what I've got on my soil. I know what I'm putting back in. I also tend to have high phosphorus. So again, you mentioned that I'm in a clay soil area. Clay soil just tends to be prone to high phosphorus levels. It really retains a lot of that. And so when I add a lot of compost, especially purchased compost that's typically made with animal manure, it adds phosphorus to my soil, and that can lead to things like nutrient uptake issues, iron uptake issues, calcium uptake issues. And it was very difficult to get rid of high phosphorus in your soil once you have it. So I don't like using a lot of purchased compost for that reason. So not only does this help me to refresh my beds in a more affordable way, it also helps me quality control what I'm putting back into my soil. So the other question that I thought you might have is, how deep am I going when I am shoveling soil out of the walkway? So let me just kind of show you, because I've left this part here exposed so that you can see what I mean. So here is one where I have shoveled off the soil and plopped it up and onto the bed here next to it. And you can see that I've kind of scraped down just where my shovel will easily scrape. And then you can see I stop when I get to this kind of clay layer. So this is what our natural soil is like without all the cover crop and organic matter. It's pretty heavy clay. We can make a pretty nice little marble out of it. And I don't really want to be putting this back up and onto my beds, because I've worked very hard to make my soil not like this. So not that there's anything inherently wrong with clay, it just can become anaerobic. It's hard for roots to work its way into, but this is what our natural soil is like. So this, in contrast, which is what I shoveled up and off, is kind of our loamy. It's got good organic matter in there. This is what I added to the top of the beds. That's kind of how deep I go. It's kind of when I feel like I've hit that clay area. And you would think that this might be compacted. That might be another question that you have. Isn't this soil in the walkway compacted? Well, it might be more so in the summer, at the end of a summer season, when we've really been walking back and forth on it. But after winter, we haven't been on this soil very much. And then that thick mulch layer also helps keep it from getting compacted. So even though we're walking on the walkways a lot, that mulch does help. So I am coming in and I am topping off. Again, I mentioned that now the mulch layer is a little bit thin. So I'm just doing another scoop of wood chip mulch here on the pathways. Now again, this is just kind of step one for our spring prep. So we are going to come back. I am going to do more work here just right before we plant. And if you've taken our regenerative gardening course, it's mostly going to be our broad forking step and our alfalfa fertilizer step. So that's kind of what we do just right before we plant. But other than that, these are going to be pretty much ready to go. I'll also do an irrigation check and just make sure there aren't any holes in my lines, because I do keep my lines in place over winter. These are pretty thick, and I haven't found that I have many issues leaving them in place, but sometimes they need an occasional patch or two in the spring. So I will usually wait and do that right before I plant as well, and just make sure I don't have any holes or things going on with my irrigation. I hope this video was helpful. pretty short and to the point. It's not very complicated, and that's what I wanted to get across. So if you have any questions, guys, remember we have a full course talking about all of these practices and a little bit more in depth with cover cropping as well. I'm going to link that down below. And if you have any questions, remember, just put them down below. Happy to answer what I can. Don't forget to subscribe, please. That helps us so much here at the farm, and we will see you guys around here next time.